So let's talk about shifting privacy in. More specifically, let's talk about how privacy and security threat modeling can and should be friends. You might see a bit of a theme there too. I am a privacy engineer. I was one of the lead designers of the Linden threat modeling approach. And I basically love to talk about all things security too, privacy and threat modeling. So what do I talk about today, and also what do I want you all to remember from my talk today? 3 key messages. Privacy is important. I cannot stress that enough. Threat modeling is really useful. That's why we have this awesome conference here. But it's equally useful for privacy, not just for security. And privacy and security can and should be friends because, well, they strengthen each other, security and privacy. Although you need kind of a different mindset to capture or to tackle both. When you combine both, when you have a security and a privacy threat modeling analysis combined, you actually get a more efficient and more effective result. So let's dive into the details. Privacy is important. Privacy matters. I consider myself a bit of a privacy advocate. I like to explain what privacy is about, spread some privacy awareness, and I often get feedback like this. Well, I don't really care about privacy. I do nothing wrong. I have nothing to hide. Well, you're wrong. We all have things to hide. Privacy matters because when you are thinking of your offline life, you will see that. If you think about your house, your home, the place where you feel comfortable, you would feel really, really uncomfortable when you have people staring into the windows, looking into your living room, your bedroom, knowing everything that you're doing, what you're eating, who you're talking to, what you're talking about. And the same applies in the online world. And because we have all this really cool technology, we have all these really nice applications, smart appliances, smart devices, our personal lives become more and more digitized. And that's awesome because that makes our lives so much easier, but that also comes at a cost that we should be aware of, because that also means that a lot of our personal information is being collected. For instance, do you know what your car can collect about you? There was this recent study by Mozilla, and they showed that modern cars can collect your name, address, phone number, payment information, also obviously a lot of things about how you use the car, your driving habits, your driving style, the way you accelerate, the way you brake, the places you've been to, your itinerary, and that's really useful, of course, because that makes it possible for the car to adapt to your specific needs. It makes it possible to predict traffic jams, but there's more. Marital status, race, education, medical information, genetic information, biometric information, audio recordings, video recordings, information about your sleep, about your sex life, about your religion, your car. And what do they do with that? Well, apparently they have a lot of fun with it. So just let that sink in for a bit. Think about it. This is just your car. You have lots of other devices, applications that are all collecting this kind of stuff. And that's kind of uncomfortable, right? I mean, we as individuals really rely on the product developers, on the companies that make this stuff to handle our information with care. To implement this properly, to implement that by design. And until recently, companies were like, yeah, sure. Now, fortunately, we have lots of data protection regulations such as GDPR, CCPA, that are basically enforcing privacy by design, privacy by default on the companies. And that's really, we really see a change there, a turn. We really see that companies are starting to embrace that privacy by design approach. And yes, I know all of you are already doing security. And that's awesome. Actually, that's really useful because I would say that privacy is a bit the younger sibling. Security is a much more mature domain already. So rather than saying we need yet another way of doing privacy and having all different ways to tackle that, we should integrate it, align this. We have all that work. We know how to do security, how to do secure by design. So let's just do the same for privacy and integrate it. Now, Avi touched upon that in his talk. Privacy is related to confidentiality, related to security, but it's really not a synonym. Privacy and security are not the same. Similar to the CIA triad for security, privacy also has its own triad, which is unlinkability, transparency, and intervenability. Or if you prefer the NIST terminology, that's disassociability, predictability, and manageability. So what does that mean? Well, if we talk about unlinkability or about linking, that means that you can tie bits and pieces of information, data items together, personal information. And because you tie those bits and pieces of information together, you can learn a lot more. Yes, you can deduce the age based on date of birth, but obviously unlinkability is about much, much more. And we have all that information. So for instance, you can deduce pregnancy from your wearable. You can deduce pregnancy from shopping history. It goes as far as that you can deduce what TV show somebody was watching based on fine-grained smart metering readings. So lots can be deduced because all those bits and pieces can be tied together. Then there's transparency and intervenability. I like to tackle them together. We all know these kinds of pop-ups. I don't know what you do, but typically I just click on the big green button and get on with my lives. And that's exactly why these dark patterns are applied, why they are used. First of all, the actual information is really small, kind of hidden, so we might be selling our soul. There's a lack of transparency, obviously. But also, you're being nudged to go for the less privacy-friendly option. You don't really have any fine-grained options. It's kind of a take it or leave it. So there's also a lack of intervenability, a lack of control. So this is what we don't want from a privacy perspective. So we have security, confidentiality, integrity, availability. We have privacy, which is unlinkability, intervenability, and transparency. They're different, but they actually go hand in hand. They actually should be best friends. Because, well, Tanya mentioned it before too, threat modeling is really useful when you have diverse perspectives. It's also one of the threat modeling manifesto patterns. And this also applies to security and privacy. Because yes, from a privacy perspective, we need security. We need confidentiality. If we just have all the information out there, then there's not really much private about it. But in addition, so a security threat modeling exercise analysis focuses kind of deeply on the underlying tech, on what the attackers might be doing. It really focuses on protecting the assets. From a privacy perspective, which by the way is an important takeaway here, privacy strengthens security almost as much or as much as security strengthens privacy. So what does a privacy threat modeling analysis do, or privacy by design? So from a privacy perspective, we don't really focus on the assets. We focus on the data, the personal information. We focus on the individuals. And because we focus on the individuals, we, rather than focusing on all the technical details, focus on how that information flows through the system, what's going on with that. And that's really also an interesting perspective for security analysis. And of course, privacy is not just the perspective, it's not just the analysis, it's also privacy as a concept that can strengthen security. Think of the minimality principle, that it's kind of essential for privacy. Well, that if you have minimized your information, you also reduce security breach impact, because basically the less information, the less can leak. Okay, so let's talk about privacy threat modeling, but not just about privacy threat modeling in isolation. Let's talk about how can we now integrate this stuff into security threat modeling. Well, we all know the 4 questions. So rather than going over these 4 steps for privacy specifically, let's walk through them and see what are kind of the do's and don'ts and the key differences for privacy and security. So first of all, we need to know what we're working on. We need to understand the system. So from a security perspective, we need to know the assets. We need to know the data. We need to know where it's stored, how it's stored. Now, from a privacy perspective, we want to dig a bit deeper. We do not want to see data as a blob of information. We need more fine-grained details. We also need to know the purpose. Why is it being collected? Why is it being processed? Is that compatible? Okay, so it's not just about the assets. We also need to know the controls. We need to understand what's already in place, because that will impact our assessment. What protocols are there, what encryption is there, what authentication is there. And then from a privacy perspective, we also add the access control rules. We need to know who has access to the information. Did the individual consent to this processing? And if so, how is that consent managed? Is that maybe part of the access control system? And also similar for the security controls, what PETs, privacy-enhancing technologies, are in place already? The identification techniques, for instance. And then also we care about the actors. What users are there? What roles do they have in the system? What type of attackers are we trying to protect our system, our product against? And privacy is also about the individual. The individual is really core, and it's not the same necessarily as a user, because you can also have information in your system that is about people that are not users to your system. So you need to consider those as well. So yes, outsiders are important too from a privacy perspective, but it's also essential that you kind of do an internal reflection, that you consider the organization itself as an attacker, a misactor, because it's often the organization, the system, that is abusing information from a privacy perspective. Just to highlight the difference between data input from a security perspective and from a privacy perspective. So let's look at this very simple system. We have an application that stores some pictures to the cloud, to a backend, whatever. So from a security perspective, well, you will see, okay, we have some communication. There might be some information disclosure issues, so we probably have some encryption and some access control. That's all. We don't dig deeper into that information. For privacy, we're just getting started. Yes, there's explicit data, but look, it's pictures, so maybe we know who is in the picture, or we can see something in the background. And then there's all that additional implicit meta information. There's people tagged, there's places tagged, there's time, there's camera specifications. So there's a lot of additional information that often you are not really aware of, that's also really important and interesting information from a privacy perspective. Because all these different bits and pieces of information can be tied together, can be linked, and that means that you can infer even more information. You can infer, okay, well, Alice and Bob were at a restaurant on February 14th, so probably they were having a date on Valentine's Day, so they're in a relationship. We know the type of phone Alice has. We know a lot about Bob. We know a lot about Alice. And that's just based on this one picture with that meta information. Of course, there's a lot of additional resources, the backend, but also external sources that are typically used to combine all that information. So a lot can be deduced from combining bits and pieces of information together. Also, finally, there might be actions that trigger this. It might be that Alice, when she takes a picture on her phone, that picture is automatically being uploaded to the cloud. Is she aware of that? Are you aware of that when you do the analysis? So that's all the information you basically need to know to do a very structured threat modeling exercise from a privacy perspective. Okay. What can go wrong? We know what we're working on, what can go wrong. We're interested in security threats. We're interested in privacy threats. Maybe, and in a room like this, that's very likely, maybe you're an expert and you can just go with your expertise, with your experience. And that's awesome. If you want some more support, you can also look into reusable knowledge bases. You all know Stride, there's Linden, there's lots of others. Some focus on security, some focus on privacy, some do the combination. Let's quote the manifesto again. It's important, though, to realize that this should not be a flat checklist. It really should be an inspiration rather than just making it a check-the-box exercise. So I'm often asked, what is the best thing to use to get started with privacy threat modeling? So let's give you my really biased answer. I would suggest Linden. So Linden was Linden was created about 13 years ago now, very much inspired by Stride. So if you're using Stride, if you know Stride, it's really easy to add Linden to that. So Linden is also an acronym for the 7 threat categories that are that we consider the most important to tackle. Quickly going over them. Linking, I talked about that before. That means you tie bits and pieces of information together to learn. Identifying means that you are tying the data to an actual individual, to an actual person. Non-repudiation means that as an individual, you cannot deny something, you cannot deny involvement. So that's a different thing than from a security perspective where that might be a requirement. Detecting, it's kind of like side channel attacks. You don't actually have access to the information, but just by observing communication, you can deduce additional information. Data disclosure, or I prefer disproportionate disclosure, means that you process more than you should. And processing means collecting, storing, sharing, and actual computations. Then there's unawareness. That's kind of the soft category that ties back to that transparency and control or intervenability goal. And then the final one, non-compliance, is kind of the catch-all bucket to say, well, privacy should not be done in isolation. We depend on best practices from security, data management, legal compliance, because all of those are also important to have a good privacy analysis, privacy by design. Now, Linden is more than just an acronym. Similar to Stride, Linden also has knowledge that is structured according to these categories. You have threat trees, or you also have that information in the form of cards, which is the Linden Go card deck. And if you want my biased opinion, I would suggest starting with the cards as kind of a way to get started, because it provides a lot of guidance on how to apply these threats. Talking about how to apply privacy threats, I think this is also where there's a bit of a difference between security and privacy, because if you're thinking about spoofing, about tampering, when you have found a situation where it can apply, then basically you're done. But from a privacy perspective, you want to know, well, can it occur? But also, does it matter? Would it be a problem to the individual? Because, of course, you will have lots of places where bits and pieces of information are linked, where information is identifiable or identified, because that's basically what your functionality requires. That's basically what you need, because we cannot have just anonymous systems. So you need to make that reflection. If you're really a privacy purist, you would say threat modeling ends after the first question, but in practice that really doesn't work. So I suggest to really reflect on what does it mean for the individual. Would it be a problem? Okay, So we have all that information, we can apply it, but we want to do that in a combined way. We want to do that for security, we want to do that for privacy. Should we just throw it all together on a big pile, or should we do first security, first privacy? How should we do that? Well, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer. I think both work. The important thing is to remember that you have these diverse perspectives, those different mindsets you need. So when you go back and forth through security and privacy, it's important to realize that you have to change hats. My suggestion would be, if you're going for an initial kind of ad hoc brainstorm, then throwing it all in a pile works. If you're going for a more thorough, systematic analysis, you are going to scope your exercise, your analysis anyways. So better just do a focused one on security and then a focused one on privacy. Why in that order? Well, my experience says that if you start with privacy and you make that really clear, well, people know security. So the first part of the session, they will start talking about confidentiality and integrity anyway. So let's get that off the table and then focus on privacy. OK. We know what can go wrong, so we also want to document that. It's the same for security threat modeling. We want to document the threats, but we also want to document the assumptions. What's important here is that you do that in a way that the people that need to read the documentation do not fall asleep. So it needs to be to the point, it needs to be relevant, it needs to be up to date, it should be actionable. OK. We know what can go wrong, we want to fix it. Typically, people think of PETs, privacy-enhancing technologies. It's kind of a big thing, especially in the privacy community. We're going to fix everything with de-identification techniques. And that's great, but to me, that's kind of a final solution. I think we first need to go for strategies, tactics, patterns, really tackle the problem first, see, do we really need the information? If not, don't, or maybe separate it in the way how to store it. There's lots of ways to tackle privacy issues before you're going to reside into those pets. What is important here is that here we really bring security and privacy together, that here we really align them also with functionality, because we really do not want that layered approach where you add security and then add privacy on top, because that doesn't work. If you already have a system that requires EID to authenticate an individual, and then the privacy person says, well, for this functionality, for this feature, we also want anonymous use, well, that's not going to work. So instead of having it as an add-on, we really are striving for full functionality, a positive approach. So no add-ons, we want to integrate privacy early, and together with security, we really want to go for a combined mitigation that works for both. So, are we done yet? That's the same question to answer for security threat modeling. What's important here is that, what is useful to know is that from a data protection, from a compliance perspective, GDPR, for instance, requires a risk-based approach. So threat modeling is great here. You just need to be able to prove that you've reached an acceptable risk level for the individual. So that's basically the question you're asking here. Is there any residual risk left? And then there's the typical stuff that you do for security threat modeling too. Did we cover all the aspects of the system? Did we cover all the different bits and pieces of the threat knowledge? And it's a continuous process. OK, so tying it back together, privacy is important. Threat modeling works for security and privacy, and security and privacy threat modeling really can and should be friends, because security and privacy strengthen each other, though they require different mindsets. When you combine them together, they become much more efficient, much more effective than doing a security threat modeling exercise and a privacy threat modeling exercise, because they share the same foundation. All right, thank you for your attention.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Kim. We have time for questions. If anyone wants to raise their hand, we'll bring the mic around. Oh, okay. So you're first and you're next.
Hi. Okay, linkability. I've always found this one confusing. So I got an API called Profile. It returns your name, your email, your phone number, and the unique ID that you are in the database. Well, then I got another API. Well, of course, that returns the unique ID. I mean, ultimately, that becomes linkable, but there's no other way to build a system. I don't, this one has always confused me in privacy, so I just don't understand, because it seems to me everything is linkable if the system is vulnerable.
Yeah, so that was one of my points exactly. I've worked in academia, so I've had a lot of philosophical conversations, and I have a lot of colleagues saying it's all a privacy threat, and you should document it and tackle it and assess the risk, and then maybe you can say, well, we need it. I don't think it works that way. I need to tackle it pragmatically. You really should think, well, is this something that affects the individual? Is it a problem that, I don't know, when you have some government system and there's an EID linked? Well, of course, because you need so, because otherwise it doesn't work. So in that case, that's fine. But if you're building a system that functionality-wise is doing something really privacy invasive, but you can get the same results in a less privacy invasive way, then of course you should go for that. But it's not like, okay, it's linkable, so by default it's an issue. It really, yeah.
So you talked about cars and the data that it is like very excessive, and still to date there's no way for an individual to kind of de-identify themselves. You go into a rental car or you sell your car, all your data is there. So with that threat, is GDPR addressing that threat, or is it?
I was hoping so, but apparently not. Yeah, so it's, yeah, I'm not an expert on the car stuff, but it's also, it can be collected. There's no proof that it actually collects. It's based on the privacy notice that they say we might be tracking all of this information. But there's, right, I mean, I don't know any cars that say, well, you can sign out here for your personal information to be collected. So that's.
Right. I attended a workshop a few years ago where we took this application that pulled everything from the main ECU, and we were supposed to see if we can identify the person and whether they committed this murder. It was actually used in court, and the person was convicted just from all the data collected from the car.
Wow. I'm so gonna use this example next
time. Yeah, I'll get you the information because
yes.
It's like really interesting. So,
thanks.
One, maybe two more. Was it you, Jeff? Or was he right here? You, right? Or was he? There you go.
Hey, Kim.
Hi.
My question is acceptable level of residual risk, GDPR. How much is an acceptable level of residual risk?
To answer like all the GDPR lawyers answer, it depends. Yeah, there's not really a good answer there. Some lawyers would say it depends on how much budget you have to pay the fines, but I would say it depends on how you consider your individuals at risk and how sensitive the information is and at what scale you are processing it. So if you are somebody who owns a shoe store or whatever, and you just are sending out a newsletter, then that's a completely different scenario than when you are one of the big Meta Google ones that are sending out a newsletter on large scale. So it depends on the sensitivity of the information. It depends on the individuals involved, the scale. Yeah, it depends.
The last question about consent.
Yes.
Okay, so for the car, probably when I buy it, somewhere there I've signed that they can collect A to Z or whatever anything else is. But one big problem that I have usually with the consent is that there's no I mean, I'm signing for everything or for nothing, right? So if I don't check I consent, which collects whatever information, I can go ahead. I cannot, let's say, get a cell phone service or whatever that is.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with this? Because none of the, there's no prescription about that, and there's no way to enforce it.
Yeah, so, well, actually, GDPR says that it should be specific and informed and, do you know the third? Yeah. So, actually, it is in legislation, but the way to enforce it, it's still kind of broad. So, if you talk to lawyers, they will say, well, to some lawyers, they will say, well, it needs to be that fine-grained, and you need to be able to have that option, but they also tackle it pragmatically, which is fine, but it's really hard to get that level where it's okay. So yeah, that's back to the acceptable risk, and yeah, I would say from a by design perspective, you do the best you can to protect the individual, but from a compliance perspective, you do what the lawyer tells you, basically. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kim Wuyts, Privacy. This is the end of the talk.